I guess we're going to show a few slides, and in order to do that we have to turn the lights down. So that's the first step. We're going to talk a bit about some of our sculptures, not all of them, but some that we've selected. And we're going to speak a little bit about the origins, such as this. This is 1963 in Los Angeles, and a work that was on exhibit in the Dwan Gallery was taken outside and photographed in different situations, such as this gas station. This photo is by Dennis Hopper, and the idea was that it was beginning to dawn on me that the objects that I'd been making could be enlarged in city situations and could become part of the landscape. This led to a series of fantastic proposals, such as this one for Central Park in New York, where all the trees would be removed. Central Park made into a pool table, and large balls on the scale of the machines at Cape Canaveral would move around the table. They would be office and apartment buildings, and also every morning they would be in a different situation, which would be nice for the people living around the park. Many proposals were made at this time. This was in the 60s, and they were in different cities. This one was for London, where they had just removed the statue of Eros in Piccadilly Circus, and there was going to be refinished. And this was a proposal for a substitute in which the lipsticks would rise and fall on the rhythm of the Thames. Someone said to me, when are you going to make these reality? And the opportunity came when the graduate students of architecture at Yale University in 1969 commissioned a work. This was a very hot period in campus activity, lots of controversy with the war going on, and there was a special tension at Yale because women were about to arrive. The university was going coeducational. And the proposal that I made for them was a lipstick on a caterpillar track. And the idea was that the lipstick would rise and inflate with a pump up on the deck, so that when you wanted to speak about something that you had on your mind, you would get up on the platform, pump up the lipstick, and speak. And as you spoke, the lipstick would subside, and you'd have to pump it up again if you had more to say. And when you were finished, you could get off, and the next person could get up and do that. The sculpture, we didn't have enough money to put the sculpture into its full activity of rising and falling, so that it was installed in this form in a very central place in the university, which is in front of the War Memorial and the President's House, where it remained for some time until it was removed and relocated. If you go up there now, you'll find it in Morse College campus. But this was the beginning of making sculptures out of metal on a large scale for outdoors. And it proceeded through a number of pieces, and one of the pieces, of course, eventually was the clothespin, which was the first sculpture on in an urban situation. The clothespin had its origins back in a proposal for a late entry, as it was called, to the Tribune building competition of 1922, which was a competition for the newspaper Chicago Tribune. And this was submitted as an alternative to the Gothic skyscraper that won the prize, and you can see in Chicago. So the clothespin began its existence here and went through a number of changes, and eventually became this poster and print which you heard about for the 72 exhibition of Object into Monument held here at the museum. And there is the kiss on the lower left and the inscription. In these days, the sculptures were not as site-specific as they later became. The clothespin had been many things. It had been an addition, and as you've seen, it was in Chicago, and it finally landed in Philadelphia, which seemed to be its proper home, and subsequently became the clothespin at Center Square through the agency of the Volgens, and then it acquired all kinds of connotations which were almost coincidental, like the comparison of the spring to 76. This happened in the bicentennial year. The clothespin that was erected at Center Square was a really rather elegant version of the print. And it's typical of all the work that we do that the object is redesigned. That is, if you compared this to an actual clothespin, you would see that it was very different. It's more the idea of the clothespin, and the object is reduced to its absolute essentials and totally deprived of its function. In fact, it has a new function, which is to be the artistic object that it has become. This, as you can see, is a new type of clothespin, and this clothespin is the only one with these proportions, and all the others have slightly different proportions. In 1976 was also the moment when Kosher first came to America, and she attended the inauguration of the clothespin, and it began a whole new approach to these large objects. Our first work together was with the trowel, which is shown here being installed in the Netherlands, later in 1976. The trowel had originally been a silver color, and Kosher had seen it sited in another part of the park. This is in Otterlo, the Kröller-Müller Park, and she said it looks too much like a cake spade, and I don't like the location, I want to change it. She said, I want it to be blue, the color of the workers' overalls, and I know a wonderful space in the garden where it should go. And then it was relocated, and that became our first work together. Ever since then, the emphasis on the specificness and the preciseness of location has been very strong, thanks to Kosher, in the work, and has given each work the particular character of its location and its time, as well as its place.
We may ask ourselves what a public place entails. I hardly ever speak about public art because I don't know what public art is. I do know what art is, and I do know what a public space is. Art is something that cannot be a common denominator of taste. And a public place is an urban site that has been put together and made over a period of many, many years and become mostly anonymous. We may ask ourselves then what a public place entails. Let's take as an example the center of Cologne, a city sprawling along the Rhine River in Germany and a crossroad of civilizations. The famous neo-Gothic cathedral built over many, many centuries, a 19th century equestrian statue of Friedrich Wilhelm IV, a Prussian general, was once prominently located at the foot of a bridge. Cast in bronze, larger than life, in a tradition dating back to the Renaissance, the statue was intended as a commemoration. But today, the name of the sculptor long forgotten, the view is obstructed by electricity lines and fast trains speeding alongside it, their sides covered with high-gloss spray painted graffiti. Pop culture begun underground has surfaced above ground. What might be categorized within the pristine white walls of the museum as high and low, applied and fine arts, such boundaries are non-existent within the cityscape made up of nearly surrealist composite images, of unrelated objects and buildings, fragmented and thrown together over time, merged with or without the aid of city planners into an ongoing process of erosion. Knowing the congestion on the street level, we were lucky enough to get a commission on top of a roof. In thinking about the site, the Neumarkt Gallery, a shopping complex, we came up with a strong mnemonic image, and interested in the physical properties as well in the iconography, we came up with a monolithic object in the form of a colossal ice cream cone that we dropped on the edge of the roof on the corner of the building. The cone is a form between sculpture and architecture. It echoes the spires of the dome and other churches, which are the most characteristic shapes in the skyline. But our cone differs in that it is slanted. The melted ice cream running down the sides of the building's glass wall is a sign of evanescence. However, putting a sculpture on top of a building is a long, long tradition, as we may see. William Penn, mounted on the tower facing northeast, not necessarily what Alexander Milne Calder wanted, but there he is, about the size of our ice cream cone. William Penn's 37 feet bronze statue, and the result of 20 years of work. And then, looking along the Benjamin Franklin Parkway, we see the indomitable prizefighter Rocky Balboa during the filming of Rocky V, a 9-foot bronze movie prop relegated to a Spectrum Sports Center. And we may ask ourselves, maybe 25 years from now, our sculpture too will be relegated to a sports center. Of course, there is another general on a horse, and actually Washington. A sculptor, English sculptor, David Mark, knew what to do with horses and its riders. And we may ask ourselves today, what will not be toppled? Here, the residents of Addis Ababa climbing a statue of Lenin in celebration of the end of the Ethiopian regime. Quite Swiftian, like Lilliputians on Gulliver. What we are after is a vision combining the marvelous and the actual. It is sometimes celebrated as the Spoon Bridge and Cherry, and sometimes vilified as the 3 pool balls in Münster. The moment it was put up, the students sat on top of it, began to deface it, and had a song, roll the balls in the Aasee, roll the balls in the Aasee. However, about 15 years later, a young Japanese artist, Tazuro Nishino, probably inspired by Magritte, asked us permission to use one of the balls for one of his installations. A little house was built around the ball. And so we struggle on. And boy, do we struggle, because we work in the city surroundings, and our most important counteractor is the architect. The architect who today has taken over museums and builds museums and makes us put up our works in wavy walls and tries to get attention as being a sculptor. And yes, I have news, we can't compete with the architect, whomever it is. In this case, a building of Kohn, Pedersen and Fox, and Klaus will say where the sculpture is. When you have an imagination and you can draw, like Klaus, you can see it from a different perspective. Here we see the Hancock building from the other shore of Lake Michigan, drawn in 1969. But it's true. Why to walk into buildings when you can walk between them? So we work on street level. And that is really where our work has to be. And in this case, the inverted collar and tie, which is trying to slither off its pedestal in Frankfurt in front of the Deutsche Genossenschaftsbank. Our work then is not intended to be expanded over a total city area. Our work at its best works in a site on street level, in a plaza, in a park, and sometimes it becomes the identification of a neighborhood, as happened in Barcelona. It is interesting to know that one can play with verticality and horizontality. Like here, the White Star Line RMS Olympic, over 700 feet wide, is compared to various famous buildings. And we see the St. Peter's and the Pyramid of Giza, the Bunker Hill, the Washington Monument, and again Penn and the Woolworth Building. Alfred Stieglitz took picture after picture of New York's first skyscraper, the Flatiron Building, rising for 23 floors. The vision during a snowstorm he had was that the Flatiron Building appeared to be moving toward him like the bow of a monster ocean liner, a picture of new America still in the making. When Klaus was asked to make a sculpture, a site-specific sculpture for Chicago, the first thing that occurred to him, besides many childhood memories, were the vertical structures. Chicago is very flat. It's along the lakeside, and many structures stand up. He thought of the bat subject in relation to Chicago because he had made a drawing, bat spinning in the speed of light, so fast it would burn one's fingers if it was touched. It looked, though, as if it absolutely was standing still. In looking at the structures, we see here a chimney, the Hancock building, and the Sears building turned upside down. And that idea of turning the building down with its white end up, more like rising into the air, it, like a tornado, it suggested to him the idea of an open, structured bat. In a way, it related to the steel frame discovered in Chicago after the Great Fire and the essence of the first skyscraper. The bat was connected to the formal idea of a column and got the name Bat Column. It's in front of a Social Security building, and it was put up at the time that across the street was a slum area. Now, site specificness is very specific in our case. It means a certain time and a certain place. There were columns of the Northwestern Station. There was a water tower. From the beginning, as he knew that the site would change, he related his sculpture to the Hancock with its crisscrosses and the Sears Tower. And when he asked me if the color red would be the right color, I suggested instead a gray, like a more architectural structure, to get away from the idea of only sculpture. And this is the bat column today. And now you understand that site specificness is not controlling of what happens around our large-scale project. Instead, our large-scale project becomes a historical vehicle of a certain time and certain place. The columns of the Northwestern Station are now located in the large skyscraper behind the bat. What we try to do is to combine our individual perceptions with the collective consciousness. We take a stereotype, an everyday object, usually handheld, for instance, a bat or a flashlight, and transform it into a sculpture by reducing the object to its essentials in terms of form and color. We eliminate the original function and give the object a surprising scale and position in relation to the site, at the same time maintaining its identity. The flashlight for Las Vegas was put up in 1981 in between a theater of the university and a concert hall. Differently from the bat, which is more architectural structure, we related the flashlight, also a column, to plant architecture, and we thought of Blossveld, and there was a huge cactus on the campus. We combined then the cactus form, the idea of the light held aloft, and the Dune sign, no longer in Las Vegas, and created a flashlight turned upside down. The sculpture may be thought of as a piece of night extending into the day, like life on the strip where the night never ends.
This is a view of the sculpture garden of the Walker. The Spoon Bridge in Cherry. For a long time, I tried to make something out of a spoon. I stood it on end, I turned it over, I put holes in it, and nothing ever worked. And then one day, Kosha said, the problem is you don't have anything in the spoon. So she said, and she took something which was lying near the spoon, the model that I was working with, and she said, why don't you put this cherry in the spoon? It'll make a huge difference. And so she put this cherry in the spoon, and that indeed made it into the sculpture that it always wanted to be. And it was situated at the end of a road that leads into the sculpture garden, and the requirements were that it be a focus. At the same time, it wasn't supposed to dominate the garden because, as you can see, there are other sculptures around it. So what we wanted was something that was fairly horizontal, and yet something which led the eye down this path. The sculpture is actually a fountain, and what happens is that water comes out of the stem. Not much water, because we like our fountains to be rather laid back. The water dribbles out of the stem, it rolls around the cherry, which has the effect of making the cherry very colorful and glistening, and then it collects down in the bottom of the spoon and runs out. And it keeps it sort of lubricated during the hot summer months. And then, of course, there are, in Minneapolis, winter months, and we had to take that into account. The original idea was to make a skating pond around it, and we saw a certain relationship between skates and the silver spoon. Unfortunately, that never happened, but the spoon does survive in winter and does not have to be covered up like the other sculptures, because it can hold its own, and the water's turned off, but it's part of the landscape. In Paris, there's a park created at the northeast end of the city, which was part of the Mitterrand program for making sculptures, public sculptures. And Bernard Tschumi designed a series of follies, which are these red constructivist buildings, one of which you see in the center there. And the whole garden, in fact, was very constructivist and disciplined and very rational in a French style, like a French cemetery. And we wanted to have an object that was a bit mysterious, at the same time extremely rational. So what we conceived of here, it actually came from Kosha's reading of Beckett's Malloy, was a bicycle that was buried. At first you would just see the parts sticking out, and you'd wonder, what in the world is this? And you'd see them as separate sculptures. Then it would dawn on you that they were all connected, and they were all part of a 50-meter bicycle which was buried underground. And Philip Stark put some chairs there, scattered them around, but the idea was that this bicycle would come up in a sort of uncalculated way in the midst of all of the careful landscape planning. At the same time, the bicycle would make sense. You can see the parts here, and they're all very logically related. That is, if you extended them down, you could reconstruct the bicycle, but they seem to be very disparate. You see one of Tschumi's shanties there in the back. This is a very popular park for kids, and a lot of bicycles are usually scattered around. And in fact, the sculpture is one of the ones that has been overused. We have this problem because we do like people to climb our sculptures. We really don't like it, but we can't say that. And And so we do what we can, but some of them get worse, or they're more popular than others for this sort of thing. And the usual activity here is for the family to drive up to the spring there on their bicycles and raise the children to the spring, and then the children swing over on the top and slide down. But you can also run up the side like this kid's doing. And as a consequence, the sculpture has gotten kind of used up. But these pictures show it in its original pristine grandeur. And we are just, since we are also live part of the year in France, we are just about to go out to the park and tell them that the trees have gotten too tall. Because in fact, the trees are now twice as tall as they are in this picture. And this is another one of the dangers of outdoor sculpture, if you get too close to trees. Some of the projects that we do are incredibly complicated with local politics and all sorts of unpredictable circumstances. This was probably our most complicated project, which took place in Cleveland. The Standard Oil Company had built a new skyscraper with an atrium in front of it, and we had won a commission for a sculpture there. It's located in the center of Cleveland near the famous statue to Liberty, a Civil War monument. And we normally don't take corporate commissions, but because this was in the center of town and so prominent, we decided we'd give it a try. And we came up with a proposal for what we call the free stamp. You can see it there in its original proposed location where the stamp was standing up, and it's standing on a stamp pad which doubles as a base. And the fact that it says free on it, which was Koch's idea, can only be guessed at by walking around it and reconstructing the parts. You can't see the word, but it's there. Now, what happened was that Standard Oil was taken over by British Petroleum, and British Petroleum said, no way are we going to put a sculpture in front of our building. So that was the end of that proposal. And it went on for several years, and there were demonstrations in Cleveland in favor of the sculpture, and several governments changed in Cleveland. And finally, it became possible somehow to put this sculpture up somewhere in the city if we avoided this particular site. And Koch had a very great notion, which fell within our requirement of site specificity, and that was to pick up the stamp and hurl it a few blocks down, where it would land next to City Hall in a park that leads to the ballpark you can see in the back there. Now, as it landed, it would expose the letters free on the underside, and it would become really an entirely different sculpture, and yet the same sculpture, and it would be just as good a sculpture, perhaps even better sculpture, and it would have a reason behind why it was lying there. So it appealed to us in every possible way, and for some strange reason it appealed to everybody. It appealed to BP because it wasn't in front of their building, so they backed it. And they had a progressive mayor for the moment, and he backed it, and so did the city council. And we had a wonderful installation and a party at which we were presented with stamps from all of the government offices in Cleveland. And there was a free lunch, of course. And the whole community was very, very excited about it. And this is the way the sculpture looks today. And they take very good care of it, by the way. It's repainted every 4 years very carefully. So in the end, it became a good example, and for about 6 years, we were really never expected it to happen at all. This is an architectural setting in Tokyo. Talk about competition with architecture. The saw that you see there is our proposal for the site. The site is a very gray site and seems to be obsessively triangular. Everything possible that can be turned into a triangle is a triangle. And it's a convention center known as the Big Site, and it lies on the other side of the river in Tokyo. Now, when you make a sculpture for a country that lies outside the Western reference, like Japan, you have a bit of a problem, because in the first place you don't understand the stereotypes. You only understand the stereotypes that they use, which are yours, but there are others, of course, which make up their culture. So it's very difficult to propose something, and if you propose something which you think is in their culture, they won't accept it. So we had to come up with a subject from our culture which in their culture would appear exotic enough to make a difference. Now it turns out that we use different kinds of saws. If you go to a store and buy a saw in Japan, it doesn't look like this. So that was the perfect thing, and Kosha picked it off the shelf. It had been an earlier proposal which hadn't been accepted, and she said, this is perfect. And the reason it's perfect is because this architecture is all about levels. And we have this saw, and it will just cut through the levels, besides which it has a triangular motif, and also it has color, and it will become the only color in the whole setting. So we made this proposal, and it was accepted. And there you see it installed. You arrive on a train from Tokyo, and this is the first thing that you see. And it's kind of demonic. It's almost like a dragon. The original idea was to have it planted in a garden, and when this picture was taken, the garden wasn't quite completed.
Sometimes the sculpture is not visible. However, the football team is. Sometimes the sculpture has become a commemoration, in this case for students with AIDS. The poodle looks at it, and still we don't know what it is. And sometimes, just like a cigar is sometimes a cigar, a clothespin may be a clothespin, we see the split button as a sculpture in front of the Van Pelt Library at the University of Pennsylvania. And it was Borges, the near-blind writer, who once visited the university and jotted down a personal observation on this sculpture. I am quite sure that Mr. So-and-so, whose name I can no longer recall, saw something at a glance that no one had ever seen before since the beginning of history. What he saw was a button. He saw that everyday artifact which so engages the fingers, and he understood that in order to transmit his disclosure, the revelation of something so simple, he must augment its size and execute the vast and serene circle we see at the center of a square in Philadelphia. Borges wrote the essence of our sculpture. A perfect circle with 4 perfect little circles, like the ground plan of Philadelphia by William Penn. And then a discarded object, a so-called obstacle monument. We don't use pedestals, we try to avoid them, and we try to push the parameters of what art can be and how it can engage the students who pass by every day. And it's in their care. And sometimes it is depleted and then it gets repainted. Sometimes it's just like a pet. It's something they don't think about. They sit on it as a bench. But they are fond of their button. It is an emotive image. And I always saw it as stumbling upon knowledge. You don't do it through intense research only. Sometimes the thing that is most discarded is right there, lying in front of your nose, the split button. A little bit an orphan in comparison to the clothespin, but just as worthwhile. And in its surroundings, very appropriate. It's interesting to think about priority of visual image or verbal expression. When Klaas and I begin to work together, we start normally with talking, not so much with an image. Oddly enough, most writers start with visual images. For instance, Italo Calvino, who always had a visual image at the source of all his stories. And around each image, then others come into being, like analogies. Or Garcia Marquez, who took a snapshot of his parents dancing on the deck of a ship when he wrote his stories. We begin mostly in communicating, and right at that same point, we begin to draw. Klaas draws the first little sketch in a small notebook. This is a project which is called British Ship and Bottle of Notes, and it was a project that was commissioned by a very small town, Middlesbrough, in the north of England, an industrial city in northeastern England. We were not so much interested, but when we heard that this city was depressed and that the steel kilns were left and that they tried to transform the northern part of England into a situation with lots of artworks, we got more interested, and especially when we found out that Middlesbrough was the birthplace of Captain Cook. And that immediately gave us a lot of associations. And let me try to tell you how we think at looking at this small notebook page. Our first idea was a Swiftian one, and we thought of Gulliver's Pocket. And we knew that the natives like to pickpocket the explorer. And we thought about a spyglass or a snuff box, but that is not adaptable to sculpture. However, the idea of the container carried over. We considered a kind of a vessel. For example, a shipwrecked sailing ship. And then England, which is an island, could also be like a bottle floating in the North Sea. And from there, Edgar Allan Poe's MS found in a bottle. Why not a bottle kind of ship? Ships are often built in bottles. And then in a Swiftian reversal again, the bottle took the place of the ship. And in the end, we came up with the little bottle we see lying there, a bottle made up of writing. And here it is. The outside of the bottle consists of a quote I found in Captain Cook's journals. And it reads, "We had every advantage we could desire in observing the whole of the passage of the planet Venus over the sun's disk." Now, this was one of the official journals of Captain Cook, very public. It is written in Klaas' handwriting, and it has been cut out of steel with a blowtorch. However, the inside of the bottle is a very personal note in the form of one of my prose poems. I like to remember seagulls in full flight gliding over the ring of canals, a melancholic thought of Amsterdam with its rings of canals, and on the other side of the North Sea and Middlesbrough. So public and private phrases eclipse one another, separating yet merging in an abstract play of line. And it is this intimacy, this idea of trying the private to continue to be part of the image, to try to have the hand part of the industrial fabrication process, and to try to create a so-called public work of art that start out from a stereotypical object and then is in conflict with our own freedom of expression, individual, intimate thoughts, and combine all of it in a unity of opposites. The same thing we did for Lincoln, Nebraska. There we used Klaus's notebooks. He has special notebooks he carries around just for in the case that he has an idea or wants to make a drawing on archival paper. And when the notebook is filled with all kinds of things, lists of bringing clothes to the cleaners or drawings, at the end he tears them up and keeps the notes, which are then collected in binders. We have a collection of about 5,000 to 6,000 of these notes from the beginning of his career, 59, till today. And when we were asked to make a large-scale project for Lincoln, Nebraska, the university, we realized, driving from Kansas City over the Great Plains to Lincoln, that especially in the Midwest, there is a lack of landmarks. And of all the bewildering things about a new country, the absence of human landmarks is one of the most depressing and disheartening, wrote Willa Cather in All Pioneers. Lincoln has its torn notebook flying up like a bird with texts which relate to Klaus and my observations, his in the form of objects like barbed wire or roller skate or donut, and mine more poetic and contextual like falcons atop flagpoles or ocean grasses and buffalo peas.
One of the things that made it possible to make these kind of sculptures, and in many cases they were the first of their kind, was the certain factories that sprang up which were dedicated entirely to making sculptures, such as the Lippincott factory, which made a lot of the early works. And when we went over to Middlesbrough, Kosha described the bottle, we found a similar factory where the bottle was cut out like this. But more and more we became impatient with steel fabrication and the simplicity of it and the weight of it. And Kosa was eager to get into more dynamic forms, and I had a tendency to symmetry, but I also liked symmetry that was off balance. And we needed to find some new materials and a new way of fabrication. When it came to the inverted collar and tie, that was the end of our metal fabrication. We tried very hard to do it in metal up at Lippincott, but finally gave up. And we switched to an entirely new industry, which was just beginning on the West Coast, which involved enlargement by digital computer practice and realization in fiberglass, which was reinforced and strong, very strong. At the same time, it was very light. Here you see one of many such drawings that we did for the inverted collar and tie to test the wind load and the gravity load. And this was the end result of the enlargement from a smaller model. Now, digital enlarging is not so perfect that you can take anything and suddenly make it larger. You still have to fair it and you have to work with it in its enlarged form because it's not terribly exact. But it can be done, and you can take a handkerchief and you can enlarge a handkerchief to any size you want and by doing this kind of thing. And so we were able for the first time to translate soft forms into large-scale works. There's a close-up of the same sculpture, and you can see how intricate and very natural and soft effects you can get in using this material. Kansas City. Kansas City has a very neoclassical, strong, beautiful building which stands in the middle of two fields of green. And I had encountered it before, and I always thought of the building as a kind of net that stood in the middle of a playing field. And when Kosa and I were asked to do a sculpture for this rather forbidding large area, we first thought of something related to the net idea, which was tennis. But Kosa had an experience in the museum. She fell asleep in front of a Frederick Remington painting. And it was a painting with a lot of feathers in it. There were Indians riding across the plains. And she woke up and she saw all these feathers and she says, "No, we've got to have some feathers in this." And the thought first was of a bird that would fly over and drop some huge feathers throughout the field. And this gradually developed and joined the idea of the ball and became the shuttlecocks, which were to drop in the field on both sides of the museum. Here you see them from the main side, and looking from the museum down, there are 4 of them, all in different positions, each one taking in a part of this rather forbidding field. Before we put these things on the field, people were afraid to cross the field. It was so vast. But this kind of humanizes it and gives it a little bit of lightness, which that museum was very much in need of. The facade was very ponderous. Of course, there was a lot of reaction to this. And we haven't even mentioned the fact that almost every sculpture that we proposed has had a lot of reaction. I mean, it's the clothespin one, but every one has been the same. And we feel this is because we don't want to give people exactly what they expect, and that we want to do something that sets an example. And so when there's controversy, we take it to be quite natural. This museum had been for so many years a kind of hierarchical castle, a feudal autonomy. And I remember having a show here once when they were protesting the fact that the museum was used for debutante balls and things like that. So, I mean, it really had a hierarchical status. And what we did with these shuttlecocks was to lighten it a little bit, you know, and make it a little bit more welcoming so people could come in there. And we also did mention Charlie Parker and his Yardbirds and so on. And there was a kind of a relationship more to the community. This is the one on the other side, which is on its end. And there you have a gathering around it. Kosia is standing here with a daffodil behind her back, and that's because she is the one who creates the colors for the sculptures, and she makes them very exact. And in this case, we're doing a sculpture for Eindhoven in the Netherlands, which is called the Flying Pins, which is bowling pins hit by a ball. And they're yellow, and Kosia is saying that she wants them to be the color of the daffodils because she'd observed the daffodils growing in Eindhoven at a certain time of the year. And on the left is Serge, who is our main fabricator on the West Coast. We had shifted, after working in the steel on the East Coast, we had shifted our fabrication to the West Coast and now do almost all our work either outside of San Francisco or Los Angeles. And this is outside of San Francisco. It's a close-up of the piece after it's been installed in Eindhoven. The ball is sunk in the ground, which was Kosia's concept to give it a more dynamic effect. And it's at an intersection, at a very busy intersection in Eindhoven, where the traffic is constantly coming and going. Kosia also felt that it would be even more dynamic if the pins did not rise straight up in the air as they do, but that they were kind of pushed along in a horizontal pattern. And that does create a feeling of movement, which is comparable to the automobiles coming up at the intersection and stopping and starting. Sometimes when we make a sculpture that is like architecture, such as the binoculars, which became the centerpiece of a building by Frank Gehry in Venice, California, we are faced with the fact that we have to deal with an interior, which is a very rare thing. I mean, our sculptures normally don't have interiors, and it never comes up what's inside a Henry Moore, for example. But in this case, we had to have an interior because we were working with Frank, and Frank is an architect, and we were part of his building. So what you see here is the interior of a binoculars. It's a binoculars room, and we couldn't think of anything to do with it, and neither could Frank. And we wouldn't let him do anything with it because we thought that it would be a room that would be purely for inspiration. And in order to hasten the inspiration, we created a light bulb. As you have in the comics, where the light bulb goes on, the idea comes, and it's a very elongated light bulb which hangs from the ceiling, and right next to it you see a slit, which is a window. Frank said, every building has to have windows, otherwise it's not a building. So we found a very obscure spot on the sculpture, and Kosia put that window in, which qualifies it as a building. From the outside, you see the binoculars in the center of Frank's design. And it's a very strong statement, and it's a very unusual thing for an architect to allow an artists to make such a strong statement in the center of their complex. You enter the building through the binoculars, and behind the binoculars is a kind of meeting room where when it was first built, was an advertising agency, and they would meet there and plan their advertising. And when they ran out of ideas, they would send the people into these rooms with the light bulbs. It's another view of the building. Now we're in Venice. And this was a sculpture that also had to do with the facade and with architecture. It's a lion's tail that stuck out of the window of the exhibition we were having at the Museo Correr in Venice in 1999. Seen from the other side. It's a soft thing, and it implies, of course, a very large lion on the inside.
Most of our large-scale projects are configurations which are fixed and made out of durable materials. We have, though, one project, the soft shuttlecock, that is actually a piece that it has a configuration that can be rearranged over and over again. It belongs to the Guggenheim and was here shown in the same building in Venice, in the Correr Museum, as an Icarus falling from the sky. Then in Bilbao, the Frank Gehry, built by Frank Gehry, it is a far more formal configuration. And here it is seen in the Guggenheim. I originally thought of it as an homage to Amelia Earhart and Frank Lloyd Wright, because the feathers echo the glass ceiling and their multi-directional way of horizontal and vertical really show the spiral of the rotunda as well as the smaller rotunda. Our last project was for Milan as part of a redesign of the Piazzale Cadorna by the 73-year-old female architect Guy Olenti, who changed the facade of the station by creating a rhythmic repetition of columns in front of a new bold grid. Places for kiosks, small businesses, and rest areas around pools of water were all part of a larger configuration, providing focus, but at the same time an expansion of and rearrangement of the plaza and the traffic. Our idea for Milan came about because Guy kept giving us brochures about the logo for Milan, which happens to be a serpent and a sword. And in transformation into a formal equivalent, and trying to find something that would be colorful but pull the plaza together, as she told us that she wanted us to be a kind of center point of the plaza, we came up with the idea of the ago filo nodo, or needle, thread, and knot. It's made up out of stainless steel and fiberglass, and you have to imagine you make a knot and you stick it into the fabric, it comes out on the other side, and at the moment you pull the needle again into the fabric, the thread begins to crinkle. It also relates to the musical treble clef and the idea of circulation in subway maps, which are very often colored in the colors green, yellow, and red. We put the knot deliberately not in the center of the fountain so that it would not become a traditional fountain. It's on the side. And Italian families love to take their picture next to the knot. Each artist, each writer, and each sculptor at one moment in time has to face by him or herself the great unraveling in order to find what matters, truth. In taking the risk to fail, the creative process is unleashed, and I wish for all of you that moment of illumination. Thank you.